PS5 update. So there's been a few updates since my last video, including new firmware updates released from PlayStation for the PS4 and PS5. So firstly, for the PS5, we're now on version 13.0 as the latest firmware. And of course, this one adds the new PSSR, PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution upgrades to the PS5 Pro. So that's now included in this new update, 13.0. And then for the PS4, we're updated to 13.50, which just says that they've improved the messages and usability on some screens. But they have actually patched a couple of things in there as well that we'll discuss. So firstly, the Luac0re exploit has been confirmed to still work on the latest firmwares on the PS4 and PS5 despite these new updates. So Geji, the developer behind the exploit, has shown a screenshot showing it running on 13.0 on the PS5. So with Luac0re Revenge, that exploit is still working up to the latest firmwares, and I've also tested it on the PS4 up to firmware 13.50, and you can see it runs no problem on that firmware too on the PS4. So Luac0re is in fact still working. It's also been updated to version 2.1, so it's been optimized and there's been improved stability with the exploit, so it now runs first time no problem, pretty much every time you try to load it on the PS4 and PS5, and also it runs faster, especially on the PS5. It gets loaded a lot quicker than it did previously, so I definitely recommend updating to version 2.1 for a better experience when loading the exploit. There's also been a new log server added, so you can run the log server with Python on your computer and then send the payload over, and then whenever you execute any other payloads with the Luac0re exploit, it will now print out the debug information to the log on your PC, so you can get more information when you're loading your payloads. That's also been added into the repo. Now beyond that, of course, this exploit could be chained with the kernel exploit on the PS5 to be able to jailbreak up to firmware 12.0, but if you're on the latest firmwares using this, you're not going to be able to jailbreak using this until there is a new kernel exploit that works up to your firmware. You're best just staying on whatever firmware you're currently on. However, this exploit, even without the kernel exploit, has the potential to maybe run some homebrew applications and run some other interesting things just standalone. It will not be a full jailbreak by any means, but it might be able to run some interesting things. So if you're already on the latest firmware, it might be a good idea to just go ahead and get a copy of the Luac0re Revenge game from the PSN store, as it is fairly cheap on the digital store that you can get. So that would be my recommendation, but I would not recommend updating from an older firmware to the latest firmware just so that you can get a copy of this game, because generally, if you want to be able to jailbreak your PS4 or PS5 in the future, it's best to just stay on as low a firmware as possible. That is always the best policy. However, if you're already on the latest firmware, then there shouldn't be any harm in just grabbing a copy of the Luac0re Revenge game so that you might be able to run some interesting things, maybe some homebrew applications on your console in the meantime while you wait for a jailbreak in the future. Now beyond that, we also saw this release from Failoverflow, this prosperous project, which we covered in the last update video. Now this includes another save game-based exploit for a different game, which is Don't Starve Console Edition. Now there's also the Don't Starve Mega Pack, which may also work, and that actually has a physical release. So that's another game that could potentially be used, but unfortunately, it's mostly sold out pretty much everywhere already. Of course, if you're on the latest firmware, you could also get the digital copy of that game as well, as another option for loading a potential exploit. It's also fair to say at this stage, we don't really know the full extent of this particular exploit, as it is a much older exploit that Failoverflow have only just now made public, but it's an old exploit for a much older firmware. Likely, the Lua exploit with this save file is probably not going to be patched and will likely work on higher firmwares, but we don't really know the full extent of it yet, so you might want to hold off on getting the physical copy of the game until we know a little bit more information about this exploit. Now, in terms of the 13.50 update for the PS4, it looks like it has actually patched a couple of things, including the PSVue exploit. So that has now been patched in firmware 13.50. It seems that they have either blacklisted the application or revoked the license in some way, so the application no longer runs on 13.50. Now you can see if I try to load it on 13.04, the previous update, it does actually load just fine. Now obviously you can only use PSVue to jailbreak up to 13.0 at the moment. However, we can still load just the userland portion of the exploit up to firmware 13.04. You can see it loads just fine here. But when I update to firmware 13.50 just for testing, you can see that the application now shows up with a padlock symbol showing that it cannot be loaded, and if I try to load it, It says you have to purchase it from the PlayStation Store, so they have blacklisted that application in some way, so it can no longer be loaded on the latest firmware. And it looks like they may have also patched the path traversal bug in the Blu-ray player, which was something that they tried to patch in 13.04, but it seems like they didn't patch it properly, and that firmware was still vulnerable to it. However, 13.50 looks like they have hardened the security there even more and may have actually properly patched it now in 13.50. So as always, don't update to the latest firmwares and stay on as lower firmware as possible. We also got the release of Firmware 4.93 for the PS3, which is just the annual updates that we usually see for the PS3, one update a year, just for the Blu-ray player, and this is no different. So we're now on Firmware 4.93 for the PS3, and of course that means PS3 Hen and the custom firmwares will need to be updated to support this firmware version, and once it does get support, you'll then be able to install the Jailbreak or PS3 Hen on that firmware. We'll just have to wait for it to get updated. And the last thing I wanted to mention here in this video is there is another $10,000 bug bounty on the HackerOne bug bounty program for PlayStation, where of course hackers can submit vulnerabilities and exploits to PlayStation for a bounty reward. And you can see that we do have another $10,000 bounty. $10,000 bounties, again, are normally things significant like kernel exploits, are typically $10,000, but sometimes there can be multiple smaller exploits that can also get those kind of bounty as rewards. However, it's been widely reported that this is not going to be a useful bug or jailbreaking the PS4 or PS5. It seems, sometimes the developers might leak out a little bit of information about their bug report to other devs in the scene to let them know if it's going to be something useful or not. And so perhaps that's what's happening here, because the general consensus seems to be that this is not something to be particularly interested in. But as usual, we'll have to wait and see if it gets disclosed to know for sure exactly what it is. But again, I generally don't get excited about these $10,000 bounties unless it comes from somebody like the Flow, who is known for actually requesting disclosure so that we eventually see these vulnerabilities get disclosed and find out what they are within several months' time after it's reported, whereas pretty much everybody else who submits reports here never actually gets them disclosed, so they end up not really being useful to us anyway. So anyway, this was just a quick update to kind of supplement my previous update video, which came out a couple of days ago, but of course, there's been some additional stuff that's come out since then that I just wanted to, address here in a follow-up. But that's going to do it for this one, so hope you guys enjoyed this video or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and as always, I hopefully see you guys in the next